Welcome back. I am so excited that you have joined me again in the Aligned Womb, Aligned You podcast. I'm Kate Nagai, and I am your host and womb guide on this journey. I'm here to help you to lean into the language of your menstrual cycle so that you can align yourself and awaken and activate to your womb wisdom to live the most inspired life. I am so excited to jump into this episode and to dive into today's topic. So let's get started. Welcome back this week, all of my lovely listeners. I am so excited. We have a guest who this isn't my first time meeting her. I'm so excited about this topic that we're going to dive into. And I think that it's going to hit home for so many women listening to this podcast. So today we have Ellen Hooper, who is a people and culture expert. She's a certified coach with the International Coaching Federation, an accredited mediator, a passionate speaker, and loves to help individuals and groups to grow and develop. Her clients call her a coaching magician and a total legend who helps them get unstuck. She's been described by the Australian of the Year as the secret weapon. And today she is here to talk all about how we can start to share the mental workload, both at work and at home. And I cannot wait to hear what kind of secret weapons she has to offer us today, as I know that for myself, for the clients that I coach, and for almost every gathering with girlfriends, this is probably the number one hot topic of how do we unload and delegate, which seems easy, I think, sometimes, but it requires us to let go of control. And I know for myself, that's a big one. It's a nice thing to wish that my husband would take on some of the workload here, but then that also requires me to put micromanaging the grocery list or the house cleaning skills, or the list can go on. And so I cannot wait to dive into this because I know that this is a real thing that we are facing. So welcome, Ellen. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for organising our cross-continent time zones. I'm really excited to speak to you and also your listeners.
To dive into today, let's just jump right into it. I was sitting with this before we got on this call of where do I want to start? Do I want to start with work or do I want to start with family life? I felt like work made the most logical, but really every part of my body really wants to know, can we get into the household stuff? Can we get into partnerships and kids and cohabitating and, creating a life with somebody together, which requires us to share the life.
For sure. And there's a few reasons why I just love talking about this and researching this and thinking about it. And it's because just like you, it's such a regular conversation I think that women all around the world are having. But it also shows up for me at work because in a lot of my coaching work, the thing that is holding us back, or the things that hold my clients back, is often a narrative about having to be responsible for everything. Or feeling taking on responsibility. A common theme is really, people pleasing is so in our vernacular now, which is awesome that we are so aware of that. And that shows up across genders, of course, but it's often comes with a narrative that I see a lot in coaching of not letting the person in front of us down at all costs. And of course that can be a short-term trade-off that can have some long-term implications. And when we're trying to do that at work and at home, it's not surprising why parental burnout is so prevalent. But the other thing that's really interesting to me is, I developed this career in essentially being an adult educator and being really obsessed with or working a lot with adults developing skills. And I just find that so interesting when it comes to, two adults in a household and how it is that we've kind of divided the tasks. Because we'll take the same man who we're really comfortable for him to manage a company or a city or a country, and then we'll like put him in a different location and we'll be like, well, you couldn't possibly get the laundry right. And it's just such an interesting perspective how we've kind of got these assumed views about who's good at what and why. And my experience of parenting was so much trial and error. Like I didn't feel natural at it. I didn't really know what I was doing. But of course you get good at it over time. And then when you become the expert, when you've got the PhD in this like little thing that's the most important thing in the world to you, it's quite hard to let someone else experiment. It's quite hard to let someone else do what you've done, which is like trial and error to build some skills. So yeah, I'm really interested in that dynamic.
It is so true. And well, I find that, so I have 3 little ones. And by little, they range from 4 to 9. But there's this vision in your head of how you've always envisioned yourself being as a parent. And then there's like the reality check that kicks in of how much you actually have for capacity in parenting. And then I think that the third element for me is then the sometimes hidden resentments of, I want all that to still happen, and it can happen, but you need to do it then. And then forcing that idea onto somebody else without actually really ever having that conversation of what they expected their life to look like or what they wanted to be like as a parent. And it was really interesting how the small little things when my husband and I first got together, how there were things like that I'd be like, well, that's not really me, but whatever, I don't care. And then you have little people that get thrown into the mix. And those little things that were not that big of a deal, but were a difference, really become amplified. Like for myself, I'll never forget that when my husband and I were dating, the first thing that ever moved into my house of his was a television because I didn't have a TV. Like he was like, okay, if I'm going to come over here and hang out with you, this has got to change. Like, so I am bringing my spare TV over to your house because we cannot exist like this any longer. Which at the time was really amusing and cute. And it didn't bother me when we were like without children of him watching sports or television. But then it's really interesting now that we have 3 little kids of seeing that is how he copes with stress. And that coping mechanism of stress, of him decompressing by watching television, is also what he then puts upon the children. And I'm like, screen time! Doctors say only this much screen time. So there's this idea in your head. There's like the social media parent that like, you see everything out there, all the research of like how you should parent. And then you have to like also collaborate with another person and try to find a happy medium so that you're not burning each other out. So,
and there's 2 sayings that come to mind as I hear so much familiarity in both my experience and the experience of other people. And I know you speak to a lot of women, and probably we've got different circumstances of the same story. But the one phrase, which I think is a Chinese proverb, but I'm not quite sure, but it always sticks with me, and it's something like, it's not the marathon that gets you down, it's the pebble in your shoe. And I think in marriage, whatever that looks like for you and your family, that's something that, it's interesting how the small day-to-day interaction, that recurring conflict, that the Gottmans, who are, you know, amazing researchers in marriage, talk about, is the thing that can be the most impactful. And the other thing that comes to mind for me is that great meme of I was a really great parent until I had children.
Yes.
And I do think there's something so tricky but lovely about parenting. There's two key things that parenting's taught me, like kicking and screaming. And one is that this experience that input doesn't equal output. And I think that's very true, particularly with babies, but also with children as they grow. So this idea of, you know, we just show up and we give what we've got at that time. I really hate that saying we do the best we can, because I don't do the best I can every day. That's actually insane. And, you know, and then that they grow and change and become themselves on a completely different time continuum than, you know, the effort we've put in. And for someone who's, you know, I started my career as a lawyer, and so I think parenting just becomes this breaking down of control, because my experience of life was you put this in here and this spits out there, and if that doesn't happen, then you must have done something wrong. You mustn't have inputted it properly. And I think parenting teaches that. And I think the other really beautiful thing about parenting is an acceptance of that we change and evolve. And that sounds really silly. Like, I think we all know that rationally. But, you know, it's a bit like fitness or learning a language. There's nothing static about parenting. You know, as your kids grow and change and their needs change, your ability to cope with them and meet them where they're at changes as well. And Kate, you and I know are both fans of Kate Northrup, who I think does really amazing work in this space. But I recently heard her say that regulating our central nervous system is the skill of our time. And I find that so much with children. And I speak to a lot of women who have young children and talk about how then managing emotionality at work becomes really tricky, because we're at the bucket is full of managing irrational, unpredictable people. So when people show up like that at work, which does happen from time to time, if you have just spent your morning trying to get, you know, someone to put their shoes on 7,000 times, and then you go home and you spend a lot of time trying to convince someone to try zucchini, then that capacity can feel like it's held and exhausted, which is why it's so critical to work on, like, how do we share that?
Right. And, you know, I think one thing that I think I always kind of knew this, but probably never really invested much energy or time into it until working a lot with Kate Northrup and healing the nervous system. And I feel like one of the tools that have helped me really ground in my ability to parent effectively is just really showing up truly as who I am, letting go of these expectations and starting to map out where those expectations even started from. And it's really interesting to see how much of who I wanted to be as a parent, or who I thought I wanted to be as a parent, really stemmed from healing wounds that I hadn't resolved as a child. And there weren't wounds like somebody harmed me. It was just like a fear of being visible, or, you know, asking for what I really wanted, or being able to say no and feel like it was okay, right? Like, so these things as a child that perhaps were muted in my childhood or not given enough airtime, I really have worked on when parenting from now of going, rather than trying to attack it from a perfectionist point of view of like, they're only supposed to get 2 hours of screen time. I also look at like, how much capacity do I have today? And in the big scheme of things, is it going to hurt them? And can I have conversations around it instead? So instead, now it's like, okay, you know what? I'm taxed, you guys. I have nothing left to give. Go on your tablets or go on the TV and just know that we've got to balance this out afterwards with some reading or whatever. But I need downtime. So if I'm giving you downtime by watching TV, then I need you guys not to bug me in 5 minutes for a snack, right? Like, so, it's knowing where my motivation comes from, and then just really having open and honest conversations and knowing that's okay not to be perfect. I yell at my kids and then I go later and I'm like, I should say all the time. Sometimes it's like there was a big overstep, but sometimes it's more my own crap that I'm carrying. And for me to own it and going, that was really uncalled for. Mommy is really tired, or I'm trying to do these 5 different things that I have a deadline. I am really sorry. That was really wrong of me. But rather than trying to do it perfectly or to say that they're little and they should know better or whatever the case might be, I now just try to be less of a perfect parent and just try to be an honest human parent.
And there's something really, I find there's a cool courage that comes from showing up in a way that you'd like to instill in them.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you know that making mistakes is actually part of life. And I also always think about the founder of Spanx, whose name is Sarah Blakely. I'm Sarah. I'm sorry if I got your last name wrong.
I'm so loving that we're bringing Spanx into this conversation.
Yeah. But she had told this really cool story that her dad used to ask them every night at dinner what mistakes, how they'd failed. And, I think that's a really big thing that comes up for a lot in the entrepreneurial world, like failure is this kind of badge of honor. But there is something really interesting, I think, about in parenting, which is the role model of someone who's imperfect but can say sorry and accept responsibilities for when they haven't shown up in the way that they should. That's a much better learning tool, actually, than being constantly role modeled the right way to do things. Yeah, over and over again. And there's the other cool, courageous thing that I see sometimes happening is when we talk about sharing the mental load, and I think one of the reasons it feels so elusive is there aren't many role models out there. There's not much of a guidebook or a handbook. Like if you look around your parents or your bosses or your peers or your friends, I don't know that there are that many families. I think we're all kind of spinning out, being like, how am I meant to do this? And being countercultural can be really challenging. And there's really interesting research about that in workplaces. Lots of your listeners would probably be familiar with the motherhood penalty, which is this idea that when you have children and access for flexibility in a workplace, you earn, I think the most recent research in Australia was 5% less than your counterparts. But really interestingly, men who take up flexible work arrangements, their penalty is 8%.
Wow.
So I think a lot of the resistance that comes, I often hear men talk about, I couldn't possibly take, parental leave or time off, or I'd love to work part-time, but, my boss wouldn't let me. And it's easy, sometimes it's easy to hear those things and feel like, that they're coming to it with this idea that they're indispensable or really special, or, maybe it's something that they, all talk and no action, something that it's easy to say you want but don't actually want. But when things are countercultural, we do, as a society, make them much harder to access. So there's so much identity that's wrapped up in how we show up in families and the type of work that we do and we choose to do. And it's incredibly complex as well. So we've always had quite a good split, but take a strategy I think lots of people will take, which is, well, we play to our strengths. So that meant for a long time, like, I did the cooking because I like cooking, and also I hate eating terrible food. And one night I was putting my son to bed, who would have been about 4 or 5 at the time, and he said, "Can you lie down with me?" I said, "No, I've got to go and make dinner because, I'm hungry." And he said, "Yeah, because Daddy doesn't know how to do that." And those moments where you're like, oh, this is not the feminist household I thought we were creating. And it was really, it was a cool moment for us, because we had this conversation. I said, I don't think this isn't what I want our son to think. Mm-hmm. So, and just like you've got to evolve as they grow, I think, revisiting how things are split in your household and what works for you is a bit of a constant conversation. So we went to, and we still do this now, we both cook 3 meals a week, and we get takeaway 1 night a week. And it was so interesting, the shift that had, because, and we just had got into school lunch boxes, which was a new dynamic, because the 3 days each a week, which we kind of chunk together, it does mean that from Monday to Wednesday, my husband will really think about what food we have in the house, because he's the one who opens the lunchbox on Tuesday and is like, what's going to go in here? Isn't that amazing, that feeling? It's like we do it all the time, and every time I'm like, what do they eat? Like, what food do we have? How does food work? And there's someone who's really great on this stuff is Eva Rodsky, and her book Fair Play and her Fair Play cards, which I'm sure has potentially been discussed on here before.
Surprisingly not. I haven't read it yet, but it's come across my list, like, I don't know how many times. So I'm going to have to purchase this book, because this is probably about the 6th time in 2 months that I've heard about this book. So
it's a great methodology, because there's something in the methodology that often gets missed, and that's what's the standard. And I think that's what a lot of women in particular find. And, there's an article in Australia that went quite viral on a really well-known website we have here called Mamma Mia, and it was about a woman who had agreed with her husband that he would feed the dog, that he'd be responsible for feeding the dog. And it was one of those articles that was written with a lot of humour and lightly, and I felt so much rage about it because, and it was, I think, an experience that happens from time to time, which was, I think that experience you have of, should I remind him that the dog hasn't been fed yet? And we're going away, and does he know about the special vet food? And trying to, and if that's coming up for you, that means that you are the manager of that task. And I think what can be really useful for us, and which is why I like the fair play methodology, is when we can actually really divide tasks up from end to end. And that's what was so good about splitting up the meals, is that actually for 3 days of the week, one of us chose what to eat, got the groceries, made the food. And there's not so much the shuttling back and forth. And we know that in workplaces, right? If tasks have to kind of go back and forth too much between people, the opportunity for conflict and disappointment is heightened. And there's a lack of clarity about who's meant to think about what and deliver on what as well. Mm-hmm. So the fair play idea of, okay, I've got my list of tasks and you've got your list of tasks. And let's actually think about the impact of those and how long they take. And if maybe my list is looking too long compared to yours, you know, if I take out the bins onto your list, like what's the standard of that? You know, is the standard that that's done at 7 o'clock at night? Because otherwise from 7 o'clock to 9 p.m, I'm going to be thinking, has he forgot the bins? Has he forgot the bins? When should I tell him about the bins? And the dynamic's hard because then at 8 o'clock you go, honey, I was just wondering if maybe, did you realise that it's bin day today? And I think we all know that those conversations very rarely are met with like loving acceptance. Like those are the conversations that can go, two things happen. Either they're high conflict conversations like, of course I know about the bins and what I'm hearing from you is that you think I'm an idiot. Or I know the pattern is I don't actually have to take responsibility for this because you will always remind me. And so the standard thing is really, I think one of the missing kind of ingredients about when partners try to like a bit more equilibrium in what they're doing, often we can, you know, and you spoke about this at the top of the episode, Kate, often we can kind of tentatively give something back and then go, you're not doing it right, and pick it back up. And that comes, you know, that reinforces a pattern that I'm in charge of the house and you don't need to worry about all of the things that happen here. And then there's like, I think it's almost always we feel a resentment for that. And I think what's then deepest at that is like, no one takes care of me the way I take care of others.
Yes.
And that's, I think, one of the greatest heartbreaks of being a modern mum, really. I feel like that's a universal, I feel a bit teary just thinking about it. I feel like it feels like quite a universal experience of, you know, a lot of my time and energy is really spent on making sure that you are physically and emotionally and socially taken care of, and that extends the entire family. And gosh, wouldn't it be amazing to be held like that, you know, just sometimes?
Yes, 100%. And that's like something I heard on a podcast once, but then it is something that my husband and I have talked a lot about, of just like the fact that it's a running dialogue in my head, and it's not just doing the task. It's completely relieving my mental file for that item out of my head, right? Of creating that space, because you can say that, okay, I'm going to do the dishes tonight, or I'm going to do the grocery shopping tonight. But in the back of my head, like you're talking about these standards, I'm thinking, did you get the organic grapes, or did you look at how many were rotten in the bag, or like, and I start to micromanage too much, and it becomes intense. And in fact, this is like it's funny because this just happened yesterday. My daughter had a birthday party, and the birthday party was running from 12 o'clock till 6 o'clock, which meant it's going to take us a half an hour to drive there. So we wouldn't be feeding her lunch before she left, but we're also cutting close to that like dinner time, crazy hangry time, right? And so I told my husband, make sure you give the parents, because they were going to a mall, give them $10 so that she can get food if she needs it. Because I don't know if they're providing food and I don't know what time they're providing food. So just so that way, if she gets hungry, we have a backup, because she did not want to eat before she left. And then he called me and he was like, yeah, no, they're providing food, so it's no big deal. I'm like, well, what time are they providing food? He's like, well, I don't know. And I'm like, but that's a question to ask, because if they're giving her supper at 5:30 and she hasn't ate since 10 a.m., we're in that problem zone that I was trying to avoid. And so like there was this frustration with me of going, but you didn't understand the contents of what I needed you to release from my brain by doing this task for me. And he was frustrated because he was like, I didn't understand what exactly you were asking for. And this is crazy making. But for me, it was like I needed to be able to let go of that control. But then there was this part of me that just felt like if I do let go of the control, this is what kind of happens, right? Where the right questions aren't asked.
And there's something really interesting about experiential learning, which is a wanky HR term. And it's this idea that actually we learn best on the job. We learn best by experiencing things. And that's why sometimes when situations like that happen, which is often, it can calm me to think of if you learn experiencing the consequence is the most powerful learning tool. So our daughter's just been toilet trained during the day, but, she wears nappies overnight. And she has a little routine where she loves picking her clothes. So she wakes up, she gets out of her little cot bed thing, and she gets completely naked immediately. And then she takes a really long time to choose what she's going to wear. And this is really the time that she needs to go to the toilet because she's free. Mm-hmm. And we'd just been through a period of time when my husband had been working in some litigation because he's a lawyer. And it was pretty new, the toilet training thing, but I had kind of done 4 mornings in a row. And so I knew it was really important to convince her to go to the toilet as soon as she'd woken up. And I had told him that. And so, it was his morning to drop off. I was off, I was getting dressed. And her weeing on the floor was the absolute best way to learn that lesson. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I'll find it calming to go, oh, maybe he really knows now.
That's true. That is so true.
And it can be and sometimes it can be good to remind ourselves of the first time, for example, that we realised that our children being hangry was a big problem. And that can be a nice piece of grace to give to the other person who's learning.
Yes.
And then sometimes it can help us to remember the 2 or 3 times that we also forgot to take snacks while we were learning how much of a problem an unfed child at 5 o'clock is. And it's so interesting that you've brought up the snacks thing, because that's one of the big tensions in our as the kids get older, there's much more dividing and conquering of where we're going, and birthday parties, oh my goodness, their social lives. And my son in particular will often say he's not hungry compared to if you present him with food. And that's just a lesson that my husband has taken a few more times to learn.
And I think that as women being, most women, like this is an overgeneralization, and I realize that a lot of women are the primary caregivers. And because we've been in these pinch points for years, like I look at my oldest as 9, like 9 years now, I've been on this learning curve that I have it down to a really beautiful dance of like what needs to happen to avoid every possible worst case scenario. And I think that's where I struggle in letting go of control, is knowing that because myself and my children have had to learn through those pain points so many repetitive times, that now I know that there is the solution. We all know that there's the key. And then when you see it repeat again, it's so like full body frustration. And that's not my kids' work. That's not my husband's work. That is my work. And I do realize that, but it's hard work. And when we're talking about this whole topic of how we can learn to let go and divide tasks, I think this is a huge realization for us women that we have to be okay to sit back and watch for failing to happen as long as nobody's going to die. And that's what I tell myself all the time. I'm like, no one's going to die because of this experience. I am frustrated and I feel myself antsy because I want to solve it, but I need to let it play out because no one's going to die.
And it's so fascinating to me in the work that I do. So one of the big skills I often work with executives on is empowering and delegating. And I think that phrase, if you want a job done well, you have to do it yourself, has ruined us.
Yes.
And that's first attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte, so not the best role model for life advice, but it's very, very much ingrained in lots of us. But the one thing, and practice of this is often very different from the theory of it, but the one thing that we know for sure is that nothing changes if nothing changes. So if we always do the work and do the thinking, or we always rescue at the edge of the learning opportunity, then that dynamic isn't going to change. And that's really interesting. I have I don't think I've ever told, I don't think my husband knows this. When we first, with our first child, I went back to work when he was 9 months old and my husband took 3 months off work. And that was amazing for cracking open this kind of idea of really kind of turning that idea of who's the primary parent on its head. And I don't, for us personally, we have that kind of diligent split of drop-offs and pickups. I had a really hard pregnancy with my second child, so my husband really did full-time child rearing of our eldest during that period. And I don't think our children have a perspective of who is their primary parent. That's just their experience. But one thing that happened in the first weekend where we had done this switch, and honestly, it was the best time in my working parent career because I had a wife at home, and there's an Australian journalist who's written a really wonderful book called The Wife Drought. Like, we're all missing wives.
Yes.
Including my husband. Like, he doesn't have the wife that would have been available to him in the 50s. And so we'd done this big swap, and it was one of the best times professionally, but it was very, very hard personally because I had become the expert in the baby. And stepping away from that, I really kind of steeled myself up for it. And the first weekend we went to a barbecue, and my friends are always like, tell us this story again. Because went to a barbecue and we had the conversation. It was like, you're in charge now. You're the primary parent. So we're going to the barbecue and we're getting ready. And I was like, he doesn't have the nappy bag. We've got a 9-month-old. It's like, just shh, you can do this. Like, you can just be quiet. That's all you need to do because you're not in charge anymore. And then we're like putting the baby in the car and we're like, he doesn't have the nappy bag. And then we were driving and I was like, he doesn't have the nappy bag. So when we got there, I was like, well, I'm staying away from that baby. Because at some point that baby is going to need nappy change. So, of course, after half an hour, he comes up and he goes, oh, cool, where's the nappy bag? I just said, oh, I don't know. I thought you had the nappy bag. And he was like, oh. But, like they sorted out. So he borrowed a nappy from someone else and he never forgot the nappy bag again. And I think the thing when I talk to other women that they find most complex about that is, I guess, the decision not to kind of go into rescuing or conversation. And I know that some people will think, well, that seems really passive aggressive, and everyone's got a different dynamic. I just know that my husband would have felt really nagged if I was like, it's your job to have the nappy bag. We had some very clear discussions in advance about this is what this change is going to mean for us.
Yeah.
And just for us, I have just found that for him and I personally, giving him that space, like getting out of his way, has been the most harmonious way for us, but also the quickest way for him to really step into that space of accountability and responsibility. And, I don't make a habit of doing that a lot, but it felt really important for where we were in our relationship at the time. I think there are some times where you go, I'm going to step back from this and just trust.
And I think a key thing that you're hitting on here is that there is a difference between intuitively knowing when there is an opportunity for growth and when you're doing it because you're trying to prove a point, right?
Yeah,
when you're trying to win the fight.
Or punishing.
Yeah. So there's definitely times when I know that if I was to step away and to do exactly what you did, to give that space for them to make an error, and just like your husband, if I was to say something to my husband, it makes him even that much more reliant on me, which is not breaking the patterns. But also, he would get frustrated. He would get mad at me, and it would just turn our day into not so great. And so I think there is times when we intuitively know that this is a safe enough example for him to really have a big learning curve that will probably ripple into more arenas than not. Versus when it's like, you know what, I'm so angry. I'm so done with having to carry it all. I'm just going to let him fail. And knowing that it's going to be a train crash for not only him, but for your children, then that's a little different. But I think that if we can really tap into our intuition of going, is this rescuing about him or is this rescuing about me? And is it going to cause a really healthy environment for us to challenge? And I think there's nothing wrong with that. Right.
And I think that as we've got more sophisticated in our ability to talk about this together, and there's something, I want to call it a technique, but I don't want it to sound manipulative. There's a mindset I've been really working on with the kids that I found has been amazing, which is this idea of kind of assuming positive intent. So when they've got the spoon on the table and you're like, stop that noise. I have found that if I say, oh, that looks really fun, what you're doing with that spoon there, like, do you like the sound it makes? They're like, yeah. It's like, oh, actually, it feels a bit loud for me. Do you think you could do it one more time and then we could put the spoon back in the bowl? Like that, I have found helps me in a few ways. It helps me manage myself and I get a much better response. I'm not suggesting that husbands are infants, but just taking a moment I find to start with, okay, I'm just going to acknowledge your positive intention or the good thing you're doing. We were just talking this morning about, our 6-year-olds not eating dinner very much at the moment. And those micro check-ins can be really useful because sometimes you'll just be like, not now. Or like, okay, yeah, I'm ready to hear that. And it's interesting, we teach that micro yes to leaders when it comes to giving people feedback. Mm-hmm. And I find that, I really appreciate I really appreciate all the hard work you're doing with the lunch boxes. There's something I have noticed. Can I share that with you? Yeah, can be a helpful way to start those conversations. And I think if we kind of went back to the, 6 years ago now, to the nappy bag. And it's, at 9 months, like no one's really sleeping very much. The ability to do good quality conversation is pretty tricky. I do think I could have said, hey, I know that we're trialing doing these roles in a different way, and there's just something I've noticed, so can I share that with you?
Mm-hmm.
And then said, I noticed you don't have the nappy bag. That's actually something I would expect that you would kind of have in your mind now. Yeah, I don't know. Those things can I was talking to a friend about how with those intimate relationships like marriage, the layers of history of interactions can make some things that are very seemingly innocuous, and if you tried to describe them to anyone else, so red hot in a way that's really hard to unpack. So it's it's a really interesting thing to navigate. But I think it'd be remiss not to also put in the mix something that also really helps, which is, what are you doing as a family that you just don't need to do at all? And what standard do you have, and why? So we have this like whiteboard easel at our house that the kids have drawn all over the wooden outside of it. And when I was on parental leave with my second, I used to look at it all the time and think, I must clean that. I must clean that. So 3 times a day I'd walk past it and think I must clean that. And the interesting thing is, like, why? Like, it's just going to end up with Texter, in a moment. And a big thing I've broken through, much to the horror of my parents, is this idea of making your house look like children don't live in it before other people with their children come and visit you. Like, why do we do that?
I don't know, but it's so true.
And often you're just hiding things like under the bed, in the cupboard. It's silly. And so I try to think to myself, I'm helping my friends by showing them that my house looks like their house.
Yes.
And like kind of, nudging yourself into those spaces safely. So I started by texting friends of mine and saying, just so you know, I'm not going to clean up before you come over. And they're probably like, this is the weirdest message I've ever got. But and so that was kind of the first step. And, I would choose the friends that I would do that with. And then you kind of grow more and more comfortable with it. And now it's something I don't even really think about anymore. And I think our partners can help us with that, because they largely weren't raised with this like ingrained idea that everything in the house and the social interactions, like buying gifts for your in-laws is such a classic example, that they would be judged for those things. So I think they often give us a clue, like if they're looking at us saying, I just don't understand why you care about that, it just is an interesting point of inquiry. Why do I? Why do I care about that? And do I need to? And so same with, I don't buy any presents for my husband's side of the family, but I started by telling my in-laws, who are amazing, just so you know, Matt's in charge of your presents this year. So
Just
be satisfied or disappointed as you'd like, but don't blame me. And I do think those, they're little like kind of accountability tools. Because I think if I hadn't done that, we'd be getting towards Christmas Eve, and then I would be liable to go, oh my gosh, like what you've got is just not good enough. So I must go out at 11 p.m. on Christmas Eve and purchase perfect gifts for 7 people, like they like we're talking intergenerational expectations. Like the work we're doing on this is hard, and it's imperfect, and it's not very linear, and it takes time. Mm-hmm. So I do think those little pieces of communication can hold you to account for those things as well.
One thing that I have done it to reduce I don't want to say my workload, but to reduce outside expectation, how I can stop taking extra mental workload on, was I really do love plants. I love having green stuff in my house, but I have 3 kids I have to keep alive and 2 dogs I need to keep alive, that I often kill these plants. My in-laws, I love them to bits, and they buy me these beautiful exotic plants. Yeah. And yesterday they were over and my father-in-law was like, "This plant is very dry." And I said, "I have 3 kids. It gets watered once a week." I was like, "I just gotta let you know, like, this is the expectation, is I only water plants once a week. So if it requires every 2 days, you can't give me gifts like that because I'm going to kill them." So
yeah, for sure. And it's so interesting, that ability to ask for what you need. And I do think we find that really tricky. And sometimes we don't know. And then once we know, we don't know how. Mm-hmm.
But up until I would say December, I was on these plants. I wasn't going to let them die because I couldn't handle the criticism or the worry or the and finally there was just this breaking point in the new year that I was just like, I cannot keep doing this workload. Like, I cannot. Something's got to go. The plants are got to go.
We've all got little rules for ourselves, and it's always so interesting. And I think that what can tell us when we've got little rules for ourselves that we should interrogate is when we use the word should. Mm-hmm. And I was talking to someone recently who was clearly not enjoying the job that she was doing. And she said, "I should really stay for 3 years." And we've all got rules like that. And like, that's a fake rule. That's... And it's interesting to go, why do I think that? Whose expectation is it really? Is it more important than my well-being? Mm-hmm. And breaking those things down. So should's a little flag for us as well. But well done. Congratulations on your dying plants.
Yes, my dying plants. It's going to bring more life to my family by my plants dying.
Amazing.
I have loved this conversation so much, and I'm sure we could go forever, but I know that I promised you a time limit. So I want to try to honor that as best I can. But I do want everyone to walk away feeling like, because I think there's a lot of gold in this, but sometimes if you're like me, you get so caught up in the conversation, you love it, but then you leave the conversation, you're like, well, what was my takeaway? So if we can really quickly, in like a laser round, maybe you could give like one thing that would be your top recommendation of how to share the mental load in the home. And we'll do the same with work. And then we'll do the same with how to stop taking on additional mental loads. So your top tip for how to share the mental load at home.
Cool. So this is your homework, and you're going to do it for work and home. And you're going to find one thing that you're doing that you're going to stop. And then you're going to find one thing that you're doing that you shouldn't be doing, that someone else should be doing. And that might mean outsourcing something like grocery shopping, or it might mean delegating something to someone at work, or it might be saying to your partner, "I have been doing this and now I need you to do it," or even to your children. So our son puts all his clothes away now from the laundry into his drawers. Someone said to me, "Oh, well, my son can't fold things." And I was like, "Oh no, we don't do folding." So he shoves things into mostly the right drawer. So what are you doing that you're not going to do anymore that someone else is going to do? Because why not be supported? And the third thing is, what are you doing that you can just do to a lesser standard? So those are 3 things you're going to go and have one for each. And then my biggest tip for not taking on too much, especially if you're a little addicted to saying yes because it feels like what a good, nice woman would do, is when someone asks you to do something, you're going to say, let me think about it and I will get back to you. Because then you're going to really think about whether you should, in fact, be in charge of the school fete, or if you really do want to go and see your friend's son's clarinet recital.
Yes.
Let me think about that and I'll get back to you. Just give you some time and space to really think about, do I want to do that or not?
As soon as you said that, I was like, oh, how often do I just say yes on the fly?
Yeah.
That's beautiful. And that is a great womb-led tip, because if we really want to bring that back into cycle work, which is what I do, and looking at where am I at in my cycle, or where am I going to be at my cycle when I say yes to this, which will play into our energy depletion or our ability to actually do it. So,
and lots of us find it much harder to communicate that we've changed our mind about a commitment we've made, which is why I really like the idea of that proactive idea about you don't make commitments on the spot anymore. Mm-hmm. That's who you are now.
I love it. Love it. Oh my gosh, this has been so good and so rich. And like I said, I could have talked to you forever, and maybe we might have to come back on and do a whole segment just on work life, because I think home life kind of took over. But so much of what you said, I could see how it applies to work. And you did a great way of threading in a few examples of just saying, and like if you're in work, this is how you would do it as well. So it's beautiful. And I hope everyone who's listened to this just feels a little bit more empowered of fair play, of, not taking on the full mental load of home and work, and just feeling that much more confident in setting some healthy boundaries around what it is that you need. And I'm going to circle right back to something that you said that was so important, which is so that we can feel cared for as much as we care for everybody else. Because I think that statement is exactly how I feel. Is I am so cognizant, I am so aware, and I can foresee for everybody else. And sometimes I just wish the same would happen for me.
Absolutely. And I think feeling like that is such a foundation for maybe the experience that lots of us have had with our parents' generation, of this feeling of debt or guilt, that makes sense to come from this idea of no one takes care of me and there's something owed to me. And I do think it would be so beautiful to break that generationally by taking care of ourselves and asking for what we need, as hard as that is. I think it's a really interesting intergenerational idea.
Yes, I love that. So, Ellen, if people want to work with you, how can they find your work? How can they learn more from you? Where do you hang out?
So I post a lot about work on LinkedIn. So you can find me at LinkedIn, and I think my handle is Ellen J. Hooper. And then on Instagram, ellen.hooper.consulting. And I'm about to launch my first group coaching program with a little container of 6 people. So come and hang out on Instagram. I talk a lot about home and work there, and I occasionally put up a little reel of how messy my house is every now and then, because I feel like that's a nice contribution to my community. Yes, great. That's where you can find me.
Love it. And I'll have all those links down in the show notes for everybody who wants to find out more. So thank you once again. This was a great conversation. I truly, deeply enjoyed it. For way too long, as women, we have been guided to hate our menstrual cycle and to curse our hormones. We have lost the art of seeing the inner power of being cyclical. So, if this podcast is inspiring you and waking up a new curiosity of how your cycle can be your superpower, I invite you to check out the She Sisterhood. This is a monthly membership that will align you to your unique rhythm through aligned womb yoga practices, cycle coaching on how to weave your cycle wisdom into everyday life, and to be part of a community of women that are awakening to their inner power. Remember, womb wisdom equals connection to self, which ultimately equals inspired living. And if you love this episode, don't forget to rate and review. I love seeing how this information is transforming your life.